Officer Sarah Martinez had been working the night shift for 3 years running, and she'd gotten used to the rhythm of it. The way the radio chatter died down after midnight, the long stretches of highway patrol where nothing happened except the occasional drunk driver or fender bender. Tonight was different though. The rain had been coming down steady since her shift started at 11, and there was something about the sound it made against the windshield that put her on edge. Maybe it was just the weather, or maybe it was the weird call she'd gotten from dispatch about 20 minutes ago, domestic disturbance at 1247 Elm Street, which should have been routine except for the way the dispatcher's voice had crackled through the radio, like the signal was being interfered with somehow. Sarah had acknowledged the call like she always did, keying her mic and saying Unit 23, responding to 1247 Elm, but then something strange had happened. A few seconds after she'd spoken, she heard her own voice coming through the radio again, saying the exact same words, but distorted somehow, like it was coming from underwater or through a bad phone connection. She glanced at her radio thinking it was just equipment malfunction. That kind of thing happened all the time, especially in weather like this. The rain could mess with signals cause all sorts of interference. But then she tried to raise dispatch again and the same thing had happened. Her voice echoing back at her but not quite right. Not quite the same words she'd actually spoken. Dispatch, Unit 23 radio check, she'd said, and the response from headquarters had been immediate and clear. Unit 23, you're coming through fine. But then a few seconds later that echo again, her own voice saying, Dispatch, Unit 23 radio check, except it sounded wrong, like someone had taken a recording of her voice and played it back through speakers that were submerged in water. Sarah pulled over to the side of Highway 47, letting the engine idle while she tried to figure out what was happening with her equipment. The rain drummed against the roof of the patrol car, and in the distance she could see the lights of the city reflecting off the wet asphalt. Everything looked normal, felt normal, except for this radio problem that was starting to make her feel genuinely unsettled. She tried speaking into the mic again, this time very slowly and clearly. Unit 23 to dispatch, are you receiving any secondary transmission from my radio? The response came back immediately, negative, Unit 23, your signal is clean. Everything okay out there? But then that echo again, except this time it wasn't exactly what she'd said. This time her own voice came through the radio saying, Unit 23 to dispatch, are you receiving any, help me, from my radio? Sarah's hands tightened on the steering wheel. She definitely hadn't said, help me. She was absolutely certain of that. But it was unmistakably her voice, her inflection, her accent. Just with different words mixed in. Sarah sat there in her idling patrol car, staring at the radio like it might suddenly start making sense. The rain was getting heavier now and the windshield wipers were working overtime, but she barely noticed. All her attention was focused on that radio, waiting to see if it would happen again. She didn't have to wait long. Without her saying anything at all, her own voice started coming through the speaker, having what sounded like half of a conversation with someone she couldn't hear. I don't know what you want me to do, her radio voice said, sounding stressed, almost panicked. I've been driving for hours and I can't find the way back. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. She definitely hadn't said any of that. She grabbed the mic and keyed it, speaking directly to dispatch. Unit 23, I'm experiencing some kind of radio malfunction. I need a supervisor to respond to my location. The dispatcher's response was immediate and professional. Copy that, Unit 23. Supervisor en route. What's the nature of the malfunction? But before Sarah could respond, her own voice cut in again, saying, Unit 23, I'm experiencing some kind of... They won't let me stop driving to my location. The words were similar to what she'd actually said, but wrong in crucial ways. And the tone was different too, desperate, frightened, like someone who was in real trouble. Sarah decided to ignore the radio problem for now and focus on getting to the domestic disturbance call. She put the car in drive and pulled back onto the highway, but as she drove, her radio voice kept talking, describing things she couldn't see, reporting situations she'd never encountered. There's someone in the back seat, the voice said at one point. Don't turn around. Just keep driving. Sarah's eyes immediately went to the rearview mirror, but the back seat was empty, just like it had been all night. Still, she felt compelled to look over her shoulder, to actually turn around and check, even though she could see perfectly well in the mirror that there was no one there. The radio voice continued, He's been there since you left the station. He's been waiting for you to notice him. Sarah's heart was racing now. She'd been a cop long enough to know the difference between equipment malfunction and something genuinely wrong, and this was definitely the latter. But what could she do? Call it in? Tell her supervisor that her radio was talking to her, saying things she'd never said? They'd probably order her to come in for a psychological evaluation, and she couldn't afford that. Not with her mortgage payment due next week and her mother's medical bills piling up. So she kept driving, trying to ignore the voice that sounded exactly like her own, describing a reality that didn't match what she was experiencing. The address on Elm Street turned out to be a quiet residential neighborhood, the kind of place where the biggest crime was usually kids tagging stop signs or someone's dog getting loose. Sarah pulled up in front of 1247, a modest two-story house with a well-maintained lawn and a porch light that cast a warm glow over the front steps. She sat in her car for a moment, collecting herself before getting out. The radio had been quiet for the past few minutes, but she could still hear the rain drumming against the roof, and something about the sound was making her increasingly nervous. She'd responded to hundreds of domestic disturbance calls over the years, and they were usually nothing: neighbors arguing too loudly, couples having a fight that got out of hand, sometimes just someone's TV turned up too high. But as she approached the front door, she noticed that all the lights in the house were off, and there were no cars in the driveway. That was odd. Domestic disturbance calls usually meant someone was home and upset about something. She knocked on the door, calling out her identification. Police, responding to a call about a disturbance. No answer. She tried again, louder this time, but still no response. She walked around the house, checking windows, looking for any sign that someone was inside. Everything was dark, quiet. It looked like no one had been home for hours, maybe even days. That's when she heard her radio crackling from back in the patrol car. Even from a distance, she could hear her own voice coming through the speaker, but the words were muffled by the rain and the distance. She jogged back to the car, slipping a little on the wet pavement, and got close enough to hear what the radio voice was saying. The call was fake. No one lives here anymore. They moved out last month, but someone's still using their address. Sarah felt her stomach drop. How could her radio voice know that? She hadn't even confirmed whether anyone lived here or not. She grabbed the mic and called dispatch. Unit 23, can you confirm the status of the residents at 1247 Elm Street? There was a pause, then, Unit 23, our records show that property has been vacant for 6 weeks. Are you saying someone called from that address? Before Sarah could answer, her radio voice cut in again. Unit 23, our records show that property has been... Someone's been watching you all night, for 6 weeks. Sarah felt like she was going insane. The voice was definitely hers, but it was saying things that didn't make sense, providing information she didn't have. And now it was telling her that someone had been watching her. She looked around the quiet street, checking the shadows between the houses, looking for any sign of movement. Everything seemed normal, but that feeling of being watched was growing stronger by the minute. Detective Mike Chin had been working homicide for 8 years, and he'd seen enough crime scenes to know when something was genuinely wrong versus when it was just his imagination getting the better of him. But as he sat in his unmarked sedan outside 1428 Pine Ridge Court, everything about this wellness check felt off in a way that made his skin crawl. The call had come in through the normal channels, neighbors reporting that they hadn't seen the Hoffman family for over a week, mail piling up, newspapers turning yellow on the driveway. Standard stuff, the kind of thing that usually ended with embarrassed residents returning from an unannounced vacation or a family emergency they'd forgotten to mention to the neighbors. But Chen had learned to trust his instincts over the years, and right now his instincts were screaming that something was very wrong with this entire situation. The street was too quiet. Not just empty, which would have been normal for a Tuesday afternoon, but quiet in a way that felt deliberate, oppressive. There were no dogs barking, no air conditioners humming, no sounds of televisions or radios bleeding through windows. Even the rain, which had been falling steadily for the past hour, seemed muted somehow, like it was being absorbed by the atmosphere before it could make its normal sounds. Chin got out of his car and stood in the street for a moment, looking up and down Pine Ridge Court. It was a nice neighborhood, the kind of place where families moved when they wanted good schools and safe streets. 2-story colonials with well-maintained lawns, driveways wide enough for 2 cars, the occasional basketball hoop or bicycle left out on the sidewalk. But as he looked more closely, he started to notice things that didn't quite add up. The lawns were all perfectly manicured, but not in the way that suggested regular maintenance, more like they'd been cut once and then left alone for weeks, growing just enough to look slightly overgrown but not quite unkempt. The newspapers on the Hoffman's driveway weren't just scattered randomly the way they would be if someone had been ignoring them for a week. They were stacked neatly, like someone had been collecting them and arranging them in chronological order. Chin approached the front door of 1428, noting that the porch light was on even though it was early afternoon. He knocked, calling out his identification and explaining why he was there. The sound of his knock seemed to echo strangely, like it was bouncing off the walls inside the house and coming back distorted. No answer. He tried again, louder this time, but still nothing. The silence that followed wasn't just the absence of sound, it was active, pressing against his eardrums like being underwater. He walked around the house, checking windows, looking for any sign of life inside. The curtains were drawn tight, but through small gaps he could see slivers of the interior. Furniture in place, everything neat and orderly, no signs of struggle or disturbance. In the backyard, he found something that made him pause. Every piece of patio furniture had been moved to face the house, arranged in a perfect semicircle about 10 feet from the back door. 4 chairs and a small table, all turned to face the sliding glass door like they'd been set up for an audience. Chin stood in the backyard, staring at the arrangement of furniture and trying to make sense of it. Why would someone move all their patio furniture to face their own house? It wasn't like they were trying to get a better view of something. The sliding glass door just led to what looked like a family room, and the curtains were drawn anyway. It was more like the chairs had been positioned for people to sit and watch the house itself, as if the building were putting on some kind of performance. He took photos with his phone, then tried to call for backup, but his radio was getting nothing but static. The rain was interfering with the signal, which wasn't unusual, but it was frustrating. He decided to check with the neighbors before attempting to force entry into the Hoffman house. That's when he made a discovery that stopped him cold. He walked up and down Pine Ridge Court, knocking on doors, checking mailboxes, looking for any sign that people actually lived in these houses. Every single one was empty. Not abandoned. The lawns were maintained, the exteriors were in good repair, there were no for sale signs or notices of foreclosure. But there were no cars in the driveways, no personal items visible through windows, no indication that anyone had lived in any of these houses for weeks, maybe months. Chin stood in the middle of the street, rain running down his face, and tried to process what he was seeing. How does an entire neighborhood empty out without anyone noticing? How does a family end up as the only residents on a street that used to be full of people? He pulled out his phone to call dispatch directly, but there was no signal. According to his GPS, he was standing in the middle of Riverside Park, which made no sense because he was clearly on a residential street. He looked up at the street sign to confirm where he was, Pine Ridge Court, just like the address he'd been given. But when he called dispatch on his radio, fighting through the static, the response he got made his blood run cold. Unit 47, there is no Pine Ridge Court in your sector. Can you confirm your location? Chin looked around at the houses, the street, the perfectly manicured lawns. Everything looked normal, suburban, exactly like what he'd expect from a neighborhood called Pine Ridge Court. But according to his GPS and his dispatcher, he was standing in the middle of a public park. "Dispatch, I'm standing on Pine Ridge Court right now," he said into his radio. "I can see the street sign, I can see the house numbers. I'm at 1428 Pine Ridge Court investigating a wellness check on the Hoffman family." The response came back scratchy and distorted. "Unit 47, there is no Hoffman family in our system. There is no Pine Ridge Court in our system. Your GPS shows you are in an open field in Riverside Park. Are you experiencing some kind of medical emergency?" Chin felt a wave of vertigo wash over him. He was clearly standing on a paved street, surrounded by houses, but according to everyone else, he was in an empty field. How was that possible? Was he having some kind of breakdown, hallucinating an entire neighborhood? But everything felt real, the rain on his face, the pavement under his feet, the solid weight of the houses around him. Chin decided to go back to the Hoffman house and try to make sense of what was happening. As he approached 1428, he noticed that the porch light, which had been on when he'd first arrived, was now off. The front door, which he was certain had been closed when he'd knocked earlier, was now standing slightly ajar. Through the gap, he could hear something that sounded like conversation, soft voices, indistinct words, the kind of background noise a television makes when it's on in another room. But he'd already confirmed that the power was out in this house. He pushed the door open and stepped inside, his hand instinctively moving to his weapon. The voices stopped immediately, leaving only the sound of rain against the windows and his own breathing. The interior of the house was furnished but sterile, like a model home or a stage set. Everything was in place: couch, coffee table, entertainment center, family photos on the mantle, but nothing looked lived in. There was no dust, no personal clutter, no indication that real people had ever actually used this space. On the coffee table, there was a single item that caught his attention: a street directory open to a page showing a map of Pine Ridge Court. According to the directory, the street had 23 houses. Chin had counted only 7. He studied the map more closely, trying to understand the discrepancy. The street shown in the directory was much longer than the one he'd walked. extending several blocks further in both directions. And all the houses on the map were marked as occupied, with family names listed next to each address. The Hoffmans were listed at 1428, just like he'd been told. But so were the Johnsons at 1430, the Martinezes at 1432, the Chens at 1434, families that should have been living in houses he'd found empty. As he stood there, studying the directory, he became aware that the rain outside had stopped. The sudden silence was so complete it made his ears ring. He looked out the front window and saw something that made his heart skip a beat. The other houses on the street, the ones he'd thought were empty, now had lights on. Warm, yellow light spilling out of windows, the kind of light that suggested people were home, families were having dinner, children were doing homework. But more disturbing than the lights was what he could see in several of the windows. Silhouettes of people, standing perfectly still, all facing in the same direction. All facing the Hoffman house. All facing him. Chen counted them quickly, at least a dozen figures visible in different windows, all motionless, all turned toward where he was standing. He grabbed his radio and tried to call for backup, but all he got was static. His phone still showed no signal. According to his GPS, he was still in an empty field, even though he was clearly standing in a furnished living room, looking out at a street full of houses and people. The voices started again, coming from upstairs this time. A man and a woman, having what sounded like a perfectly normal conversation about grocery shopping and weekend plans. The kind of conversation he should have heard when he'd first knocked on the door. The conversation that would have explained where the Hoffmans had gone, what had happened to them. But as he listened more closely, he realized the voices weren't quite right. They were too rhythmic, too regular, like a recording that was being played on loop. And underneath the words, he could hear something else, a sound like breathing but not quite human. More like the sound wind makes when it moves through empty buildings. Officer Lisa Park had been working patrol for 5 years, and in that time she'd learned to trust her instincts about when a call was going to be routine and when it was going to be something more complicated. The 911 call that came in at 7:30 p.m. should have been routine. Woman calling about her boyfriend, said he was acting strange, wouldn't respond to her, just standing in their bedroom staring at the wall. Domestic disturbance calls were bread and butter for patrol officers, the kind of thing that usually ended with someone being told to keep the noise down or, in worse cases, someone spending the night in jail to cool off. But something about this call felt different from the moment Park heard the address. 1847 Maple Street was in a decent neighborhood, not the kind of place where she usually got called for domestic problems. The houses were well maintained, the streets were clean, and the residents generally kept to themselves. As she drove toward the address, Park found herself thinking about the caller's voice, which had been oddly flat and emotionless for someone who was supposedly worried about her boyfriend's behavior. Most people who called about domestic situations were either angry or scared, but this woman had sounded almost detached, like she was reading from a script. Park pulled up in front of 1847, a modest 2-story house with a small front yard and a porch light that cast a warm glow over the entrance. She sat in her patrol car for a moment, studying the house and trying to shake the feeling that something was off. All the lights were on inside, which was normal for early evening, and she could see movement through the windows, which suggested that people were home. But there was something about the quality of the light that bothered her. It was too steady, too uniform, like it was coming from fluorescent bulbs rather than normal household lighting. She got out of her car and approached the front door, noting that the porch was unusually clean and organized, like someone had recently swept it and arranged the furniture. She knocked and called out her identification. "Police," someone called, requesting a welfare check. The door opened immediately, like someone had been waiting right behind it. The woman who answered was maybe 30 years old, blonde, wearing a nightgown despite the early hour. She looked relieved to see Park, but there was something in her expression that didn't quite match her words. "Oh, thank God you're here," she said, though her tone was oddly flat. "I'm sorry for calling, but David's been... I don't know how to explain it. He's been standing in our bedroom for hours. Won't talk to me, won't move. I'm getting scared." Park followed her through a living room that felt staged, like a model home or a furniture showroom. Everything was perfectly arranged, perfectly clean, but there were no personal touches, no signs that real people actually lived here. No books left open, no coffee cups on tables, no jackets thrown over chairs. The woman, Jennifer, she said her name was, led Park toward the back of the house, but she kept looking over her shoulder as they walked, like she expected someone to be following them. "How long has he been like this?" Park asked, trying to keep the conversation normal while she assessed the situation. "Since this morning," Jennifer replied, her voice maintaining that same flat, emotionless tone. "He got up to use the bathroom around 6, and when I woke up at 8 he was just standing there, facing the wall. I've tried talking to him, touching him, shaking him. Nothing works. It's like he can't hear me at all. They reached the bedroom door and Jennifer stopped, gesturing for Park to look inside. The room appeared normal enough, queen-sized bed with rumpled sheets, a dresser with a mirror, a television mounted on the wall. But there was no one in the room. Park looked at Jennifer, who was staring into the empty space with growing confusion and what looked like genuine distress. "He was right there," Jennifer said, pointing to a spot near the far wall. "Right there, facing the corner. I swear to God, he was just standing there when I called you." They searched the house together, checking every room, every closet, even the basement and attic. No sign of David anywhere. His car was still in the driveway, his wallet and keys were still on the dresser in the bedroom, his clothes were still in the closet. Everything suggested he lived there, but he was simply gone. Jennifer became increasingly agitated as they searched, insisting that David had been there just minutes before Park arrived, that he couldn't have left without her seeing him. Park took a report, left her business card, and advised Jennifer to call if David showed up. It was standard procedure for missing person cases, though something about the whole situation felt wrong in a way she couldn't articulate. As she drove home that night, Park found herself thinking about the way Jennifer had looked into that empty bedroom, not like someone who was lying or confused, but like someone who was seeing something that wasn't there anymore. She'd seen that look before in witnesses to traumatic events, people whose minds were trying to process something that didn't fit into their normal understanding of reality. That night, Park had dreams about standing in corners, facing walls, unable to move or speak while someone called her name from very far away. She woke up feeling exhausted, like she hadn't slept at all, and spent the day trying to shake the feeling that something was fundamentally wrong with the world. The next evening, she got another call from the same address. This time, when she arrived, Jennifer looked like she hadn't slept in days. Her hair was disheveled, her eyes were red and swollen, and she answered the door before Park had even finished knocking. "He's back," Jennifer said simply, without any greeting or explanation. "Same spot. Same position. I don't know what to do." This time, when Park looked into the bedroom, she saw him. David was exactly where Jennifer had pointed the day before, standing in the corner, facing the wall, perfectly motionless. He was wearing the same clothes, standing in the exact same position, like he'd been frozen in place for 24 hours. When Park called his name, he didn't respond. When she touched his shoulder, he felt normal, warm, breathing, definitely alive, but completely unresponsive to any external stimulus. They called paramedics, who transported David to the hospital for evaluation. The doctors found nothing wrong with him. His vital signs were normal, his brain activity was normal, there were no signs of drug use or medical emergency. He was conscious and aware, they said, just completely unresponsive to external stimuli. The hospital kept him for observation, and Jennifer went home alone. Park's shift ended at midnight, but she found herself driving past the house on Maple Street on her way home. The bedroom light was on, and through the window she could see a figure standing in the same corner where David had been. Jennifer, facing the wall, perfectly still, exactly like David had been. Park called for backup, but by the time other officers arrived, the house was empty. No signs of forced entry, no indication of where Jennifer had gone. Her car was in the driveway, her purse was on the kitchen counter, but she was nowhere to be found. The bedroom was empty, but Park could feel something wrong with the corner where they'd both stood. When she put her hand near the wall, her skin tingled, like touching a television screen full of static electricity. That night, Park woke up to find herself standing at the foot of her own bed, facing the wall, with no memory of how she'd gotten there.